Nobody invented writing. Every book ever published, every law ever passed, every love letter ever sent traces back to one accountant in ancient Mesopotamia who needed to remember who owed him grain. The entire written history of the human race began as a receipt. Not poetry, not prayer, a receipt. And the man who made it never intended anyone outside his warehouse to use it. There are an estimated 130 million books in existence today. Every sacred text, every constitution, every scientific discovery, every story ever told in written form exists because a grain clerk in 3400 BC ran out of space in his head. Nobody planned a single word of it. Here is where it started. 3400 BC. The city of Uruk, southern Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, the largest city on Earth at the time, population somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. More humans living in one place than had ever lived in one place before. And a city that size had one problem no human brain had ever needed to solve before: too much to remember. For tens of thousands of years before this, human memory was sufficient. A tribe of 30 people, a village of 200, you knew who owned what. You remembered the transaction. The trade lived in your head, confirmed by witnesses who also carried it in their heads. Memory was the ledger. Uruk broke that system. Thousands of transactions per day, grain coming in from farms, oil going out to workers, wool being traded for copper, livestock changing hands, temple offerings being recorded and distributed. No human brain could hold it. Debts were being forgotten. Disputes were constant. The city was beginning to function like a machine whose parts could not communicate. Someone had to fix it. The first solution was physical. Clay tokens. Small-shaped pieces of clay, a cone for one unit of grain, a sphere for a different measure, a cylinder for an animal. You made a token for each item in a transaction and stored them in a sealed clay envelope. The envelope was proof. If a dispute arose, you broke the seal and counted the tokens inside. It worked. For a while. Then someone noticed something. The tokens inside the envelope were invisible until you broke the seal and destroyed the record. So someone began pressing the tokens into the outside of the clay before sealing it. An impression of the token on the surface told you what was inside without opening it. Then someone noticed something else. If the impression on the outside told you everything the token inside told you, why did you need the token at all? They flattened the clay. They pressed a stylus into it instead of a token. The impression became a symbol. The symbol stood for the thing. This is the moment. This is where it happened. Not in a flash of inspiration, not in a single invention. In a slow, practical, completely unglamorous series of optimizations made by accountants trying to reduce their workload. The first written symbols were not letters. They were pictures. A drawing of a head meant head. A drawing of grain meant grain. A drawing of a fish meant fish. Historians call this pictographic writing. It was functional, but limited. You could record objects and quantities. You could not record actions. You could not record ideas. You could not record time. But the accountants needed more than pictures. They needed to record not just what, but how many, who, and when. The next step took roughly 500 years. Someone realized the symbols did not have to look like the thing they represented. A symbol could represent a sound instead of an object. If the symbol for arrow, which in Sumerian was pronounced tai, also represented the sound ti, then you could use it to spell the word for life, which was also pronounced ti, but could not be drawn as an image. Abstract concepts, invisible things, actions and emotions could now be written down. Historians call this the rebus principle. It is the moment writing became language rather than accounting. The full system, wedge-shaped impressions in clay that could represent both sounds and objects, became what we now call cuneiform. It was the dominant writing system of the ancient world for 3,000 years. 3,000 years using a system invented to track grain. But cuneiform was difficult. Learning it required years of training. Only a specialized class of scribes could read and write it. The knowledge was power, and the scribes protected it. A city of 80,000 people had perhaps a few hundred who were literate. Writing existed, but it had not yet escaped the warehouse. That changed because of Egypt. And it changed because of one specific problem Egypt had that Mesopotamia did not: the Nile. Every year the Nile flooded. Every year the floodwaters receded and left behind the same thing: incredibly fertile black soil across an enormous stretch of land. And every year Egyptian administrators faced the same administrative nightmare. Whose land was whose? The flood erased every boundary marker, every fence, every physical indication of ownership. When the water pulled back, the land looked identical from one end to the other. Someone had to record where every boundary was before the flood came. And when the water pulled back, someone had to reestablish every line exactly where it had been. This required writing that could be fast, portable, and producible by more than a handful of trained specialists. Egypt had papyrus, a reed that grew abundantly along the Nile, pounded flat, dried, and layered into sheets. Lighter than clay, easier to carry, easier to store. And it allowed a different kind of writing instrument. Not a stylus pressed into wet clay, but a reed brush dipped in ink. Egyptian hieroglyphics, developed around 3200 BC, were still partly pictographic, but the writing surface changed everything. Papyrus allowed faster writing. Faster writing encouraged more writers. More writers meant more literacy. The knowledge began to escape the warehouse. By 1500, BC Egyptian scribes had developed a simplified cursive version of hieroglyphics called hieratic, which could be written significantly faster. A student could learn it in months rather than years. Administrative, legal, and religious texts multiplied. Stories began to appear. Medical knowledge was written down. Instructions that had previously lived only in the minds of specialists could now survive the death of those specialists. Writing was beginning to hold memory larger than any single human lifetime. But hieroglyphics still had a fundamental problem. There were hundreds of symbols. Learning them required significant time and access to teachers. Literacy remained the property of a privileged class. The system worked, but it was not yet available to everyone. Someone needed to throw most of it away. Around 1050 BC in the ancient Levant, likely among Phoenician traders, someone did exactly that. Instead of hundreds of symbols representing objects and syllables, they reduced writing to 22 symbols. Each symbol represented a single consonant sound. Nothing else. No pictures, no syllables, no logographic shortcuts. Just 22 marks, each standing for one sound in the spoken language. This was the alphabet. You could learn it in days. A merchant who spent his life moving between ports and needed to communicate in writing without employing a specialist scribe could now do it himself. A farmer, a soldier, a woman recording a household account. The technical barrier to written communication dropped from years of specialist training to a few weeks of practice. The Phoenician alphabet spread along trade routes the way trade goods did, carried by the same merchants who invented it, adopted by every civilization that came into contact with it. The Greeks took it, added vowels, and passed it to the Romans. The Roman alphabet became the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet is the alphabet you are reading right now. Every letter on this screen descends directly from a Phoenician merchant who needed to write faster. But writing being learnable was not the same as writing being available. For most of human history, the materials required to write were expensive. Papyrus did not grow everywhere. Parchment, made from animal skin, required slaughtering animals. Clay was abundant but heavy and fragile. Writing existed. Literacy was spreading slowly. But the physical act of producing a written page remained costly. Then, China solved the material problem. And it began, like so many things in this story, as an accident. Kai Lun was a court official in the Han Dynasty, working around 105 AD. He was tasked with finding a cheaper alternative to silk, which was the primary writing surface used by Chinese officials and expensive enough to limit how much anyone wrote. He experimented with a mixture of bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets, pounded into a pulp and spread thin, then dried. The result was paper, cheap, lightweight, producible from materials available almost everywhere, and smooth enough for fast brushwork. Within a century, paper was in widespread use across China. By 600 AD, it had reached the Middle East along the Silk Road. By 1100 AD, it had reached Europe. Writing now had a surface anyone could afford. But writing being affordable still was not the same as written knowledge spreading fast. Every book that existed still had to be copied by hand. A single monastery might spend years producing one copy of one text. The written word existed, but it moved slowly. An idea written in one city might take a generation to reach another. One German metalworker changed that, and he changed it trying to make money on religious souvenirs. Johannes Gutenberg was a goldsmith in Mainz, Germany, skilled in metalwork and familiar with the screw presses used to press wine and olive oil. Around 1440, he began combining existing technologies in a new way. Movable metal type, individual letters cast in alloy that could be arranged into words, locked into a frame, inked, and pressed onto paper. Then, rearranged for the next page. A single press could produce 3,600 pages per day. A single scribe could produce perhaps a few pages per day. The Gutenberg Bible, printed in 1455, was the first major book produced with movable type in Europe. Within 50 years of its publication, more than 20 million books had been printed across Europe. Ideas that had previously taken generations to spread now moved in years. The Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517 with Martin Luther nailing arguments to a church door, spread across Europe within months because printing presses could reproduce his arguments faster than the church could suppress them. Writing had become a force that could outrun institutions. What followed was a cascade that nobody in Uruk could have imagined. Scientific knowledge that had previously existed only in the minds of individual scholars could now be printed, distributed, critiqued, and built upon by people who had never met. Isaac Newton, who described his work as standing on the shoulders of giants, could only stand on those shoulders because those giants had written things down and printing had distributed those writings to Cambridge. The Enlightenment was a literacy event. The scientific revolution was a literacy event. Every political revolution that appealed to written rights, the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, was a literacy event. Every single one of them traces back to an accountant in Uruk who needed to remember who owed him grain. In 1989, a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN trying to solve a problem his institution had. Too many researchers. Too much information. No way to share it efficiently. He proposed a system of linked documents that could be accessed over a network. He called it the World Wide Web. It was a writing problem. He solved it with writing. There are now an estimated 5.5 billion pages on the internet. Every message sent every day on every platform, every video with a caption, every comment underneath it, every search term typed into every search engine, all of it is writing. All of it descends from the same root, a clay tablet in a Sumerian warehouse. A debt recorded in pressed symbols. A receipt. And somewhere in that warehouse, a clerk pressed a stylus into wet clay and changed what it meant to be human. The thought you are thinking right now, the language you are using to think it, was shaped by that moment. Not the words, the structure, the way human minds learned to hold abstract ideas by giving them a shape outside the skull. You did not invent the ability to read. You inherited it. From every scribe who spent years learning cuneiform, from every Phoenician merchant who needed to write faster, from every monk who copied manuscripts by candlelight, from Johannes Gutenberg trying to sell pilgrimage souvenirs, from Tim Berners-Lee trying to organize paperwork at a physics lab, and from an accountant in ancient Mesopotamia who simply ran out of space in his head. Click here. Nobody invented numbers either, and the story of who did is stranger than this one.